I call the member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, Australia really has a proud tradition of fine aged care services, and I think everyone in this chamber that's travelled around this great nation, wherever you visit an aged care facility, I am by and large genuinely impressed with the quality of care that's offered in the context that it's an increasingly challenging space to be working. We have, of course, the demographic shifts that have been alluded to earlier in this debate, with the proportion of Australians over the age of 70 increasing from 9% to well over 20% by 2051. But we also have the great challenge that this is fundamentally a private sector-driven area of health and welfare, and so we always need to have the appropriate amount of government support, not too much and not too little. As we look back over the last 5 years, my observation with a focus on the health portfolio is that many of the challenges that beset our health system in 2007 still remain today relatively untouched and unblemished. They are still there today, mostly not addressed. I acknowledge there's been negotiation around funding agreements, but when you're on the front line in healthcare, we really have many of the same challenges that we faced 5 years ago, and that, I think, is a significant criticism to the current federal government. If for no other reason, it's been recognised by the COAG Reform Council, who noted just last week in their report that we are fundamentally a less happy population with our health system. 24% now waiting more than 24 hours to see GP, as compared to just 11% in 2010. We're facing all of those social challenges in our health and welfare system. We are still waiting just as long for operations as we were in 2007. There's been some minor improvements in A&E through some performance payments, but by and large, we have a health system with very little change. Contrast that then with the aged care sector, a very different story. This has been a sector effectively in suspended animation, desperately in trouble, with only 40% of our providers in the black, and most of them holding on desperately by their fingernails, waiting for some kind of reform. When you're in freefall, Deputy Speaker, and facing ground rush, I accept you'll grasp for any kind of parachute you can. And in this legislation, it's already been clearly pointed out by speakers from the seat of Wentworth all the way through to Grey in some of the most remote parts of Australia, the challenges are the same. What we've seen is just a tricky shift where we've taken effectively money out of the funding instrument and we've moved it into a union recruitment tool in the guise of higher wages for staff who desperately deserve that. Now, everyone is smart enough to see that, and in my contribution, I want to make sure that some of those observations are read into Hansard for posterity, because I have an enormous amount of regard, Deputy Speaker, for the Minister and his approach to many of his affairs. But I do find that this last-minute rushed arrangement that was rolled out in Western Sydney just a month ago was genuinely beneath him. And I think clutching around for an aged care facility in which you could make the announcement, not being able to find one, then choosing a church instead in the hope that perhaps some old people behind the Minister might make it look a bit like an aged care facility was patently ridiculous. There is very little support in the sector for the goodwill within this framework of bills, certainly not for the delegated legislation that's to come sometime later that none of us can yet read. But I acknowledge that many in that sector are desperate for anything. And when you're this late in the game, when services are this close to the bone, I acknowledge that they will grasp for anything. So what we have here effectively is an offer to increase wages in a context where many services are unable to pay it. And more importantly, no matter how much one offers in increased wage deals through union and enterprise bargaining agreements, if you're ripping it out first from the funding tool, then it's almost like a futile effort in a negative feedback loop where some centres will simply not be able to survive. I acknowledge that if you're a centre of less than 60, you're exempted from those EBA arrangements, but the majority of our providers in metropolitan Australia are a tick over 60, Deputy Speaker, and they're all faced by this reality. $1.6 billion is a lot of money. It amounts to tens of thousands of dollars. In fact, for some centres, the average is around $125,000 to find. And I think the most preposterous thing of all is, in a game of where we are trying to provide certainty to the private sector and confidence to invest, let's get this right, Deputy Speaker, aged care is not an area where the government provides the majority of the services. We are utterly reliant on private providers. And to provide this 28-day buffer, where one can move into an aged care facility and only after 28 days make a decision on whether you pay up front or pay in designated allocations over time, is akin to me selling my house, Deputy Speaker, having someone agree to buy it and 28 days later say, no, I've changed my mind, I'm just going to rent. That's what you're doing in this situation, Deputy Speaker, and I ask you to reflect on that. I mean, the merits of someone who is building for the future and building for our seniors and endeavouring to provide services, to have to wait 28 days only to be told, sorry, we've decided to rent and try and not to buy, imperils effectively your entire business model. And how do you take that to a bank, Deputy Speaker? How do you convince a bank to lend on those grounds? It's enormously difficult because, believe it or not, when you build an aged care facility, you can't 28 days after they finish the completion of the structure say, we've decided to pay it off in allocations over the next 5 years. So I'd like to include from my own electorate the comments of Paul Mitchell, CEO from Adventist Aged Care, who said that these are our two key issues. The rest of it is all just machinery of government. Under the proposed change, a resident can make these decisions 28 days after they move in. And in our facility in Victoria Point, we're having a series of expansions, 89 new beds to be completed by September, and that's part of stage 1, and that will be completed prior to this legislation applying. But stage 2 is now at risk of not happening at all. So there you have it from the front line. How do you go back to a bank and explain to them that you want to lend, you want to receive billions of dollars in borrowings only to not be able to pay it back until you receive allocations or contributions over years? Look, this facility, in my electorate, will simply have to face refinancing and face the risk of not being able to proceed at all. What we have here was a very, very clever recruitment tool for the unions, Deputy Speaker, and it's very, very clearly included in union propaganda, even from the Minister's own union. And clearly there was an effort here to modify the scoring tool so that less money could be given to providers, only to see more money given to workers in the hope that that somehow balances out. And it's a murky, murky approach, and some of the most senior aged care experts in the country have said it's just not the way to do business. Now, the other great criticism that was mounted in the defence of this legislation was a very serious accusation of rorting. And I don't know what this government has in a preoccupation with singling out professions and claiming that there's a problem with rorting, and they're never providing that evidence and using it as the basis to proceed with often significantly flawed or biased legislation. When we saw it in the cataract rebate debate of 2009, when an entire profession was traduced, Deputy Speaker, on the grounds that they were rorting the system, for goodness sake, providing more vision to Australians by doing cataract rebates, and this was rorting. And then we had the same claims made against the dental profession in an effort to bring down the CDDS and effectively close out 96% of Australia's dentists from being able to deliver care to the sickest of Australians with chronic disease, all based on this claim of rorting. And what we saw was threats to the dental profession to scare them into not providing dental care with the possibility that they would never be reimbursed. And ultimately, the CDDS, which could have been refined easily and improved, was instead terminated. September, no new entrants. November, all work to be completed. And the result of that, of course, is right now, Deputy Speaker, we see Indigenous Australians having to scavenge for $300 dental vouchers from public hospitals to get urgent dental work done. That is another form of a health outcome in 2013 under this Prime Minister, all based on the proposition of rorting by professionals. Now, we don't have to do it that way, Deputy Speaker. We can work with the profession. We can work with the sector. And of course there'll be elements of rorting everywhere one goes. That is the job of the legal system. That is the job of a department doing appropriate audit to address those providers and to address those examples. But what's the first thing that happens when a minister talks about rorting in the aged care sector? Deputy Speaker, I put to you that my parents and others who might someday be in an aged care facility ask, I wonder if I'm being rorted. I wonder if this place is rorting me. I wonder if I'm being ripped off. And I think that blackening of our wonderful aged care sector is not only regrettable, but it's patently avoidable. We don't need to do that to get legislation through this place, nor to advance the interests of our aged care sector. It doesn't need to be divisive, it doesn't need to attack the providers, and it doesn't need to set up this envy-based attack between the tenant and the builder, between the aged care provider and the resident, between the provider of a health service and the recipient of one. There is another way, But in this short 5 years, this has been a recurring pattern of behaviour from a government that should know better and could do better, but instead has chosen the low road of traducing providers. I'd like to make the observation about union recruitment, because this has been picked up by many providers. By effectively, it's very, very obvious that this funding instrument is being linked to these supplements. I mean, the amounts are comparable. The first thing that aged care providers do is say, well, what is taken from one hand and provided to the other leaves me how much more worse off? It's clearly a case of a simple transfer. What we have is an obligation to enter into these enterprise bargaining agreements, and as I alluded to a little bit earlier, I wanted to read out exactly what appears in the Ministers' Union's own propaganda, and it simply says most employees on award wages need to negotiate an enterprise agreement to get the pay rise. And it continues, to win a good agreement, all potential members are urged to join united voice, to speak with one voice in negotiations. You couldn't make it any simpler than that. So I make the obvious observation, Deputy Speaker, the money that is being provided from government coffers through to union negotiated wage increases that are in turn paid as union fees to unions is spent on what? Let's reflect on where that money is spent. And it's a fairly obvious assertion of mine that the money is effectively being distorted for political purposes. And I think that too is regrettable. We don't need to draw the fine aged care sector into that kind of murky dealings. Now, it's not just me saying that. I did want to include the comments from Ray Glickman, who said we're effectively stripping money from the care of our frail older people, and not only that, but the only way to reassess the same care funds is to deal with unions. Our frail elderly being sold short. It's a reduction of existing funding by adding further pressure to an industry that's already at breaking point, and it'll inevitably impact on the wellbeing of the most vulnerable in our society. From Leading Age Services, LASA, the compact is strikingly similar to aged care reforms, and it's tinkering at the edges, and it really won't address the real issues faced by the industry. Effectively, older Australians are being shunted to one side, and this government is not producing care based on need at all, but it's delivering a system of aged care services with an imposed fiscal limit, and that's why every 73 minutes another Australian is denied access to aged care. And lastly, Catholic Health Australia CEO Martin Laverty, who I concede made balanced comments, but I wanted to take this comment in particular. A government contract for services should not, in our view, stipulate an industrial outcome. Aged care providers and their staff should be free to determine above-award employment arrangements at a local level, reflecting the circumstances of their own workplace. And it couldn't come any more clearly than that. Deputy Speaker, these should be way more than just administrative changes. They should be way more than shunting money into the pockets of our unions. Our aged care services are without doubt the finest in the world. They've waited for 5 years for this, and they should have received far better.